The goal was to use intelligence subtly, to make suggestions that appeared to come from intuition rather than inside information, and to position yourself as someone who could be trusted with secrets while never revealing how much you actually knew. The medical realities of being a royal mistress were simultaneously the best and worst that medieval healthcare had to offer. On one hand, you had access to the finest physicians in the kingdom, exotic medicines imported from distant lands, and treatments that were unavailable to ordinary people. On the other hand, you were constantly under medical scrutiny. Your body was subject to regular examination, and your health was a matter of public interest rather than personal privacy. Pregnancy, as we've discussed, was a political event. But so were your monthly cycles, your digestive health, your skin condition, and your emotional state. Court physicians monitored these things not just for your well-being, but because they might affect your ability to serve the king's needs. If you developed any illness that might make you less attractive or less available, it became a matter of urgent medical intervention. The treatments themselves were often more dangerous than the conditions they were meant to cure. Medieval medicine was a combination of genuine knowledge, superstition, and educated guesswork. The royal physicians were the most skilled practitioners available, but they were still working with limited understanding of anatomy, infection, and disease. They might prescribe mercury for skin conditions, lead for digestive problems, or bloodletting for everything from headaches to heartbreak. You had to submit to these treatments because refusing medical care was seen as either ungrateful or suspiciously knowledgeable about something you shouldn't understand. The physicians themselves were another source of surveillance and potential betrayal. They knew intimate details about your body, your health, and your private habits. They could detect pregnancy before you announced it, identify signs of disease before you showed symptoms, and make educated guesses about your activities based on physical evidence. This information was valuable to various parties, and physicians were not always as discreet as their oaths suggested. Cosmetic treatments were particularly important for maintaining your position. You needed to look young, healthy, and beautiful regardless of your actual age or condition. This meant using dangerous substances to lighten your skin, whiten your teeth, and reduce signs of aging. Lead-based cosmetics were common, as were mercury treatments for various skin conditions. The long-term effects of these treatments were unknown, but the short-term political benefits were essential for survival. Mental health was not recognized as a legitimate medical concern, but the psychological pressures of court life were enormous. You had to manage anxiety, depression, and stress without any effective treatments or even acknowledgement that these were real problems. Alcohol and various herbal remedies were the only available forms of self-medication, and both carried significant risks. The isolation from family and friends, the constant pressure to perform, and the knowledge that your security depended entirely on one person's continued favor created psychological conditions that would challenge even modern mental health professionals. The medical secrecy surrounding your condition created additional stress. You couldn't discuss your health problems with friends or family without risking political consequences. You couldn't seek second opinions without appearing to question the king's physicians. You couldn't even admit to being ill without raising questions about your fitness for your role. You had to suffer in silence while maintaining the appearance of perfect health and vitality. The economic realities of being a royal mistress were far more complex than simply receiving expensive gifts. You were operating within a shadow economy where traditional concepts of ownership, inheritance, and financial security didn't apply. Everything you possessed was contingent on royal favor, but you also had to maintain the lifestyle expected of someone in your position. The gifts from the king were impressive, but unpredictable. Sometimes he would shower you with jewelry, fine fabrics, and luxurious furnishings. Other times, weeks would pass without any significant presents. you had to budget for a lifestyle that required constant elegance while never knowing exactly what resources would be available. The clothing alone was enormously expensive. You were expected to appear in new outfits regularly, and these garments had to be of the highest quality. The fabrics were imported from distant lands. The embroidery was done by skilled artisans, and the accessories were often made from precious metals and gems. But you couldn't simply order clothing whenever you needed it. Each garment had to be approved, either directly by the king or by his representatives. The style, the color, the level of ornamentation all had to be appropriate for your current status and the political climate. You also had to maintain your living spaces to a standard that reflected well on the king's generosity. Your chambers needed to be beautifully furnished, properly heated, and staffed with competent servants. The cost of maintaining this lifestyle was enormous, but you had no independent income to support it. Everything depended on the king's continued willingness to provide for your needs. The servants who attended you were another significant expense. You needed ladies-in-waiting to help with dressing and grooming, chambermaids to maintain your living spaces, and personal attendants to manage your daily schedule. But you also needed to ensure their loyalty, which required additional payments, gifts, and favors. The cost of maintaining a household staff that was both competent and discreet was substantial. You had to think about your financial future while being careful not to appear as though you were planning for the end of your relationship with the king. Some mistresses tried to convert their gifts into more portable forms of wealth. They would sell jewelry to purchase property, or use their influence to secure business opportunities for their families. But these activities had to be conducted with extreme discretion to avoid suggesting that they expected their royal relationship to end. The legal status of your possessions was also problematic. Since you weren't married to the king, you had no legal claim to anything he gave you. If he decided to reclaim his gifts, you had no legal recourse. If he died, his heirs were under no obligation to continue supporting you. If you fell from favor, everything could be taken away without notice or explanation. Some mistresses attempted to establish financial independence through various business ventures, but this was extremely difficult. Women had limited legal rights to conduct business, and any significant commercial activity would attract attention. You couldn't appear to be too interested in money, but you also couldn't ignore the practical realities of your situation. The most successful mistresses found ways to leverage their position to benefit their families. They arranged advantageous marriages for their relatives, secured government positions for their brothers, and established business connections that would outlast their royal relationships. But even these strategies required careful management to avoid appearing to use the king's favor for personal gain, rather than simply accepting his generosity. The geographical constraints of court life created a unique form of imprisonment that few people understood. You were technically free to move about the palace and its grounds, but your actual mobility was severely restricted. You couldn't leave the court without permission, and that permission was rarely granted. You couldn't visit your family without creating political complications. You couldn't travel to other cities without raising questions about your loyalty or your reasons for wanting to leave. The palace itself became your entire world, and it was a world entirely controlled by other people. You knew every corridor, every chamber, every hiding place, but you couldn't actually escape any of it. Your movements within the palace were also monitored and regulated. There were certain areas where you were welcome, others where you were tolerated, and still others where your presence would be seen as inappropriate or threatening. The Queen's private chambers were obviously off limits, but so were many of the areas where serious political business was conducted. You had to understand these invisible boundaries and respect them without being explicitly told about them. The seasonal movements of the court created additional challenges. Kings often moved between different palaces, hunting lodges and residences throughout the year. You had to be prepared to relocate at a moment's notice, packing your belongings and adapting to new living spaces regularly. These moves were logistically complex and emotionally exhausting. Each new location had different rules, different staff, and different social dynamics. You had to quickly establish yourself in each new environment while maintaining your position and relationships. The isolation from your family and former friends was particularly difficult. You might live for years without seeing your parents, siblings, or childhood companions. Letters were your only connection to your previous life. And as we've discussed, those letters were likely being monitored. You had to maintain relationships with people you rarely saw while being careful not to reveal information that could be politically damaging. The social events that took place outside the immediate court circle were another source of geographical constraint. You might be invited to attend certain festivals, ceremonies, or celebrations, but your presence at these events was always as the king's representative rather than as an individual. You couldn't simply enjoy the entertainment or socialize freely. You had to be constantly aware of your role and its implications. The hunting expeditions that were so popular among medieval nobility created particular challenges. You were expected to participate in these outdoor activities, but you also had to maintain your elegant appearance while dealing with muddy terrain, unpredictable weather, and the physical demands of following the hunt. You couldn't admit to being tired, cold, or uncomfortable without appearing weak or unsuitable for court life. The gardens and outdoor spaces of the palace provided some relief from the constraints of indoor court life. But even these areas had their own rules and limitations. You couldn't simply wander through the gardens whenever you pleased. You had to be appropriately dressed, accompanied by suitable attendants, and aware of who else might be using the space. Even your moments of apparent leisure were subject to observation and interpretation. The literary and cultural education expected of a royal mistress was both extensive and carefully limited. You needed to be educated enough to hold intelligent conversations with scholars, diplomats, and cultured visitors, but not so educated that you might challenge the king's authority or demonstrate knowledge that exceeded his own. This required a delicate balance between appearing cultured and remaining appropriately deferential. You were expected to be familiar with classical literature, but your understanding had to be filtered through acceptable interpretations that didn't challenge religious or political orthodoxy. You could quote Ovid's poetry, but you couldn't discuss his more subversive political commentary. You could reference ancient history, but you couldn't draw parallels between past and present that might be seen as criticism of current policies. The modern literature and poetry of your time were equally complex territory. You needed to understand the current cultural trends and be able to discuss new works with visiting scholars and poets. But you also had to be careful not to appear too familiar with works that might be considered inappropriate for someone in your position. Love poetry was particularly tricky territory, since your own situation made certain themes uncomfortably relevant. Music was another essential cultural skill. You were expected to sing beautifully, play instruments competently, and appreciate complex musical compositions. But your musical education also had to serve the king's needs. You might be called upon to perform for visiting dignitaries, to provide entertainment during private moments, or to participate in court ceremonies. Your musical choices had to be appropriate for your audience and your role. Dancing was perhaps the most politically significant cultural skill. The dances performed at court were complex social rituals that reinforced hierarchy and demonstrated cultural sophistication. Your dancing partners, your position in the dance formation, and your level of skill all sent messages about your status and the king's favor. You had to be an accomplished dancer while being careful not to appear too intimate with any partner other than the king. The visual arts presented another area where cultural education was expected but carefully constrained. You needed to understand painting, sculpture, and architecture well enough to discuss them intelligently, but you couldn't develop such strong opinions that you might influence the king's artistic patronage inappropriately. You could appreciate beauty, but you couldn't be seen as having better taste than the king himself. Languages were particularly valuable cultural assets. If you could speak Latin, French, or other languages commonly used in diplomatic circles, you became more useful to the king and more valuable to the court. But linguistic skill also made you more dangerous, since you might understand conversations that weren't meant for your ears. You had to demonstrate your language abilities when it was advantageous, while concealing them when it was prudent. The intellectual conversations that took place at court required you to walk a tightrope between intelligence and humility. You had to be smart enough to understand complex discussions, but wise enough to know when to remain silent. You had to ask questions that demonstrated your interest and intelligence, without revealing ignorance that might be seen as unfitting for someone in your position. The books and manuscripts available in the court library were another source of both opportunity and danger. You could educate yourself by reading widely, but you also had to be careful about what you read and how you used that knowledge. Certain texts might be considered inappropriate for women, while others might contain information that could be politically sensitive. Your reading habits were likely being monitored, and your book choices could be interpreted as signs of your political sympathies or personal ambitions. The seasonal festivals and religious celebrations that punctuated medieval court life created unique challenges for royal mistresses. These events were simultaneously times of celebration and periods of intense scrutiny. Your behavior during these public ceremonies was observed and analyzed by everyone present, and your actions could have lasting implications for your position. Christmas celebrations were particularly complex. You were expected to participate in the religious observances while managing the social and political implications of your presence. The gift-giving traditions created opportunities to demonstrate your favor with the king, but they also required you to navigate complex protocols about appropriate presents and recipients. You had to be generous enough to show your status while being careful not to appear presumptuous or competitive with the queen. Easter celebrations involved similar challenges, with the added complexity of the religious themes of resurrection and redemption. Your participation in these ceremonies while living in a state of acknowledged sin created obvious contradictions that everyone was aware of, but no one could directly address. You had to appear appropriately devout while managing the hypocrisy of your situation. The seasonal festivals celebrating the harvest, the spring planting, and other agricultural cycles provided opportunities for more relaxed social interaction, but they also required you to maintain your elegant appearance while participating in outdoor activities. You might be expected to join in traditional dances, sample local foods, and interact with people from outside the immediate court circle. These events tested your ability to be gracious and approachable while maintaining your elevated status. The tournaments and martial competitions that were popular forms of entertainment created particular challenges. You were expected to show appropriate enthusiasm for the king's participation while managing your genuine concern for his safety. You had to understand the complex rules and protocols of these events while appearing to be naturally interested in military activities. Your reactions to the competition results could be interpreted as signs of your political sympathies or personal relationships. The religious festivals that honored various saints created opportunities for you to demonstrate your piety while potentially gaining the protection of religious authorities. If you could establish yourself as a patron of certain religious causes or a devotee of particular saints, you might gain some measure of protection from the church. But you also had to be careful not to appear too religious, since excessive piety might be seen as criticism of your current lifestyle. The court celebration of political victories and diplomatic achievements required you to show appropriate enthusiasm for the king's success while understanding the complex implications of these events. You had to be knowledgeable enough about political and military affairs to respond appropriately, but not so knowledgeable that you might appear to be influencing policy decisions. The arrival of foreign dignitaries and diplomatic delegations created special challenges during these celebrations. You might be called upon to represent the court's sophistication and the king's excellent taste, but you also had to be careful not to say or do anything that might affect international relations. Your conversations with foreign visitors were likely being monitored and reported back to their home countries, making every interaction a potential diplomatic incident. The medical and practical challenges of maintaining your appearance in a medieval court were far more complex than modern beauty routines. You had to look perfect at all times while dealing with the realities of medieval hygiene, medical knowledge, and available resources. The daily routine of bathing, grooming, and dressing required hours of preparation and the assistance of skilled servants. Bathing was a complicated process that involved heating large quantities of water, preparing various oils and herbs, and managing the logistics of privacy and scheduling. You couldn't simply decide to take a bath whenever you wanted one. The process had to be planned, prepared, and supervised. The water had to be heated in the kitchens and transported to your chambers. The herbs and oils had to be selected based on their availability and appropriateness, and the timing had to be coordinated with your other obligations. The soaps and cleansing agents available were often harsh and could damage your skin with regular use. You had to balance the need for cleanliness with the requirement to maintain soft, attractive skin. The oils and lotions used to moisturize and protect your skin were expensive and not always effective. Some of them contained ingredients that we now know to be harmful, but at the time, they were considered the best available treatments. Hair care was particularly challenging. The elaborate hairstyles expected at court required hours of preparation and the use of various tools and products. Your hair had to be washed regularly, but the available cleansing agents could be damaging with frequent use. The styling process involved heating tools, chemical treatments, and complex braiding techniques that required skilled assistance. The finished hairstyles had to last for several days, which meant sleeping carefully and avoiding activities that might disturb your hair. Dental care was primitive by modern standards, but oral hygiene was still important for maintaining an attractive appearance. The available tooth cleaning methods were often abrasive and could damage tooth enamel. The herbs and spices used to freshen breath were expensive and not always effective. Dental problems were common and could be extremely painful, but the available treatments were often more dangerous than the original problems. Cosmetics were made from ingredients that we now know to be toxic, but at the time, they were considered essential for maintaining beauty. Lead-based face paints were used to create the pale complexion that was considered attractive, but they caused serious health problems over time. Mercury-based treatments were used for various skin conditions, but they could cause neurological damage. The rouge and lip colors were made from various plant and mineral sources, some of which were harmless, and others of which were potentially dangerous. The clothing and accessories that were essential for your appearance required constant maintenance and replacement. The fabrics were delicate and could be easily damaged by wear or improper cleaning. The embroidery and decorative elements required skilled repair when they became loose or damaged. The accessories had to be polished, adjusted, and repaired regularly to maintain their appearance. The jewelry you wore was often heavy and uncomfortable, but you had to wear it gracefully without showing any signs of discomfort. The shoes available were often poorly fitted and could cause significant foot problems, but you had to walk gracefully and appear comfortable at all times. The process of getting dressed required the assistance of several servants and could take hours to complete. The layers of clothing had to be put on in the correct order, adjusted properly, and fastened securely. The accessories had to be coordinated with your outfit and arranged appropriately. The final result had to look effortless and natural, despite the hours of preparation required to achieve it. And so we returned to where we began, with the understanding that the life of a royal mistress was defined by contradictions that would destroy most modern people. They lived in luxury while owning nothing. They wielded influence while having no real power. They were envied by thousands while being truly known by no one. They experienced the heights of passion while being constantly aware that they were fundamentally alone. The romantic vision of their lives, the one that persists in popular culture, focuses on the glamour, the excitement, the drama of living at the center of power. But the reality was far more brutal and far more human. These women were trapped in a system that used their beauty, their intelligence, and their humanity as tools for men's pleasure and political gain. They were forced to perform versions of femininity that were designed to entertain rather than empower, to please rather than fulfill. They lived their entire lives in service to other people's needs, desires, and ambitions. They sacrificed their authenticity, their relationships, their futures, and often their lives for the temporary illusion of significance. But perhaps, most tragically, they were denied the right to tell their own stories. Their experiences were filtered through the perspectives of men who viewed them as objects rather than subjects. Their voices were silenced, their choices were limited, and their humanity was reduced to their utility. We remember them not for who they were, but for who they were to the men who used them. The lessons of their lives extend far beyond the medieval period. They remind us that systems of power have always been designed to benefit those who control them, often at the expense of those who are controlled by them. They show us the human cost of treating women as commodities rather than people. They illustrate the dangers of seeking power through others rather than developing it within ourselves. Most importantly, they demonstrate the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the impossible circumstances of their lives, many of these women found ways to maintain their dignity, protect their loved ones, and create meaning in situations that seemed meaningless. They survived in a world that was designed to destroy them. They found ways to exercise agency in situations that seemed to offer no choices. They created connections and relationships that provided comfort and support in the midst of isolation and danger. Their stories are not just historical curiosities or cautionary tales. They are human stories about women who faced impossible choices and did their best to survive with their humanity intact. They remind us that behind every historical narrative are real people who loved, feared, hoped, and struggled just as we do. They show us that the past was not populated by simple heroes and villains, but by complex human beings who were trying to make sense of their lives in circumstances that were often beyond their control. The psychological warfare that defined court life was perhaps more exhausting than any physical battle. Every conversation was a chess match. Every gesture was analyzed for hidden meaning, and every relationship was potentially a weapon to be used against you. The mental energy required to navigate these waters while maintaining your sanity was enormous. You had to develop what we might now call emotional intelligence to an extraordinary degree, not for personal fulfillment but for survival. You learned to read micro-expressions, to interpret tone of voice, to understand the significance of seating arrangements and gift choices. You became an expert in human psychology not through formal education, but through the desperate need to understand the people who controlled your fate. The paranoia that inevitably developed was both a survival mechanism and a form of mental torture. You had to assume that everyone was potentially an enemy, that every kindness might be a trap, that every piece of information might be used against you. This constant vigilance was mentally exhausting and emotionally isolating. You couldn't trust anyone completely, which meant you couldn't form genuine relationships with anyone. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation was profound and inescapable. The sleep that came at the end of each day was rarely restful. Your mind would race with the events of the day, analyzing every interaction for signs of danger or opportunity. You would lie awake wondering if you had said the wrong thing, worn the wrong dress, or failed to notice some crucial shift in the political landscape. The physical exhaustion of maintaining your appearance and performance was compounded by the mental exhaustion of constant vigilance. Even your dreams were not safe from the pressures of court life. You might dream of your family, of your childhood, of the life you might have lived if you had made different choices. But you would wake each morning to the reality of your situation, and the contrast between your dreams and your waking life was often more painful than the difficulties themselves. The few moments of genuine peace that you might experience were precious beyond measure. Perhaps during a quiet moment in the garden, or while listening to music, or during a rare conversation with someone who seemed to see you as a person rather than a political asset. These moments were fleeting and could be interrupted at any time, but they provided essential relief from the constant pressure of performance. The physical toll of court life was equally significant. The elaborate clothing was often heavy and restrictive, making it difficult to move naturally or comfortably. The tight-fitting bodices could make breathing difficult, especially during long ceremonies or formal dinners. The heavy jewelry could cause neck and shoulder pain, but you had to wear it gracefully without showing any signs of discomfort. The high-heeled shoes that were fashionable could cause foot problems, but you had to walk elegantly and appear comfortable at all times. The cosmetics and hair treatments that were essential for your appearance could cause skin problems, hair damage, and other health issues. The lead-based face paints that created the desired pale complexion were slowly poisoning you, but refusing to use them would have been social suicide. The mercury treatments for skin conditions could cause neurological problems, but they were considered the best available medical care. The tight corseting that created the desired silhouette could cause breathing problems and internal injuries, but it was essential for achieving the fashionable appearance that was expected of you. The constant performance required by court life was physically and emotionally draining. You had to maintain perfect posture, graceful movement, and an appropriately pleasant expression at all times. You couldn't slouch when you were tired, couldn't grimace when you were in pain, and couldn't show boredom when you were forced to sit through tedious ceremonies. Your face had to be a mask of serenity and contentment, regardless of what you were actually feeling. The smile that was expected of you had to appear genuine and spontaneous, even when you were displaying it for the 100th time that day. Your voice had to remain melodious and controlled, even when you were angry, frightened, or sad. The physical gestures that were appropriate for your role had to be performed with apparent naturalness, even though they were as carefully choreographed as any dance. The educational requirements of your position extended far beyond the cultural knowledge we discussed earlier. You had to understand the complex web of relationships that defined court politics, including family connections, business partnerships, and historical alliances that might affect current events. You had to memorize the names, titles, and preferences of hundreds of people, from high-ranking nobles to important servants. You had to understand the protocols governing different types of social interactions, from formal state dinners to casual conversations in the garden. You had to know the proper forms of address for people of different ranks, the appropriate topics of conversation for different occasions, and the subtle signals that indicated approval or disapproval. You had to understand the economic systems that supported the court, including the sources of the king's wealth, the trade relationships that affected the kingdom's prosperity, and the financial pressures that might influence political decisions. You had to be aware of the military situation, including potential threats from neighboring kingdoms, the strength of the royal army, and the political implications of various military campaigns. You had to understand the religious landscape, including the relationships between different religious orders, the political influence of church leaders, and the theological debates that might affect royal policy. The seasonal rhythms of court life created their own unique stresses and challenges. Spring brought renewed energy and optimism, but also the return of traveling nobles who might threaten your position. The court would come alive with new visitors, fresh gossip, and changed dynamics. You had to quickly assess these new arrivals and determine which ones might be allies, rivals, or threats. The spring cleaning that was traditional in medieval households extended to the political landscape as well. Old alliances might be reconsidered, new partnerships might be formed, and your own position might be reevaluated in light of changed circumstances. Summer brought outdoor activities that required different skills and created new opportunities for both success and failure. The hunting parties that were so popular among the nobility required you to maintain your elegant appearance while dealing with the practical challenges of outdoor life. You had to be able to ride well enough to keep up with the hunt, but not so well that you outshone the king or appeared to be competing with him. You had to be entertaining during the long hours of travel, but not so entertaining that you attracted unwanted attention from other men. You had to be comfortable in outdoor settings while maintaining the refined demeanor that was expected of you at court. Autumn brought the harvest festivals and the preparation for winter isolation. This was often a time when the king would make important decisions about the coming year, including military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and changes in court personnel. Your influence during these planning sessions could be crucial for your future security. You had to demonstrate your value as an advisor, while being careful not to appear too knowledgeable about matters that were supposedly beyond your understanding. The harvest celebrations provided opportunities for you to interact with people from outside the immediate court circle. But these interactions had to be carefully managed to avoid creating political problems. Winter brought the long months of confinement that could be either a time of increased intimacy with the king or a period of dangerous boredom. The reduced daylight and harsh weather created a more intimate atmosphere, but they also increased the potential for conflict and tension. The limited entertainment options meant that your ability to keep the king interested and engaged became even more crucial. The isolation from the outside world meant that any problems or conflicts within the court became magnified and more difficult to resolve. The international dimensions of court life added another layer of complexity to your existence. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries were constantly arriving at court, each bringing their own political agendas and cultural expectations. Your interactions with these visitors could have implications that extended far beyond the immediate conversation. A casual comment about trade relationships might be interpreted as a signal about royal policy. A compliment about a foreign custom might be seen as criticism of local practices. A question about international events might be viewed as evidence of your political influence or your access to sensitive information. You had to be knowledgeable enough about international affairs to hold intelligent conversations, but careful enough to avoid saying anything that might be interpreted as official policy or inside information. The language skills that were so valuable for communicating with foreign visitors also made you potentially dangerous. If you could understand conversations in Latin, French, or other diplomatic languages, you might overhear information that was not meant for your ears. The visitors themselves might try to use you as a source of information about royal intentions or court politics, and you had to be sophisticated enough to recognize these attempts while appearing to be naturally friendly and helpful. The gift-giving protocols that governed court life were extraordinarily complex and could be politically dangerous if misunderstood. Every gift had symbolic meaning, and the appropriateness of a gift depended on numerous factors, including the relationship between giver and recipient. the occasion, the political climate, and the relative status of the people involved. Accepting the wrong gift could be seen as a political statement, while refusing the right gift could be interpreted as an insult. The gifts that you received from the king had to be acknowledged appropriately, but not so enthusiastically that you appeared to be motivated solely by material gain. The gifts that you gave to others had to be generous enough to reflect your status, while being careful not to appear competitive with the queen or presumptuous about your position. The timing of gift giving was also crucial. A gift given too early might seem presumptuous, while one given too late might appear to be an afterthought. The occasions that required gifts were numerous and varied, from religious festivals to birthdays to political celebrations. You had to remember all of these occasions and respond appropriately, while also being prepared for unexpected opportunities or requirements. The sources of the gifts were also important. Items that came from your own resources sent different messages than those that were clearly provided by the king. The craftsmanship and quality of the gifts had to be appropriate for your status and the occasion, but not so extravagant that they created unwanted attention or jealousy. The documentation and record-keeping aspects of court life meant that many of your actions and words were being recorded for posterity, often without your knowledge or consent. The court scribes who recorded official proceedings might also note your presence at various events, your clothing, your companions, and your apparent mood. The letters that documented diplomatic exchanges might mention your influence on royal decisions or your conversations with foreign visitors. The financial records that tracked royal expenditures would document the gifts you received, the costs of maintaining your household, and the resources devoted to your support. These records were potentially dangerous because they could be used as evidence against you if you fell from favor or if political circumstances changed. They created a permanent record of your relationship with the king that might be used by future enemies or rivals. The scribes and record keepers who created these documents were another source of potential surveillance and betrayal. They had access to vast amounts of information about court life, and they might be willing to share that information with various parties. You had to be aware of when official records were being created and modify your behavior accordingly, while also being careful not to appear too conscious of the documentation process. The transportation and travel arrangements that were part of court life created their own unique challenges and opportunities. When the court moved between different residences, you had to be prepared to relocate quickly and efficiently while maintaining your appearance and status. The logistics of moving your belongings, your servants, and your household were complex and required careful planning. The transportation itself was often uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, but you had to arrive at your destination looking fresh and elegant. The journey provided opportunities for private conversations with the king, but it also created situations where you might be observed by other travelers or local populations. The accommodations during travel were often less luxurious than what you were accustomed to at the main court, but you had to adapt gracefully without complaining about the reduced comfort. The different residences had their own staff, their own customs, and their own political dynamics, and you had to quickly establish your position in each new environment. The local populations that you encountered during travel might have their own opinions about your role and your relationship with the king, and these opinions could affect your safety and comfort. The seasonal illnesses and health challenges that were common in medieval times created additional stress and danger for royal mistresses. The plague outbreaks that periodically swept through Europe could devastate court populations and create panic among the nobility. Your access to the best available medical care provided some protection, but it also meant that your health was constantly monitored, and that any illness could be seen as a sign of divine displeasure or political vulnerability. The common colds and fevers that were routine parts of medieval life could be dangerous if they affected your appearance or your ability to perform your duties. The digestive problems that resulted from rich foods and questionable sanitation could be embarrassing and potentially damaging to your reputation. The headaches and fatigue that resulted from the stress of court life had to be endured without complaint or visible signs of discomfort. The reproductive health issues that were common among women of the time could be particularly problematic given the political importance of your fertility and your relationship with the king. The treatments for these various ailments were often more dangerous than the original problems, but refusing medical care could be seen as ungrateful or suspicious. The artistic and cultural productions that were part of court life required your participation and support, but they also created opportunities for political missteps and cultural misunderstandings. The poetry that was performed at court often contained coded political messages or references to current events that required sophisticated interpretation. Your reaction to these performances was observed and analyzed for signs of your political sympathies or your understanding of court dynamics. The musical performances that were regular features of court entertainment required your attention and appropriate response, but they also provided opportunities for other nobles to demonstrate their own cultural sophistication and potentially outshine you. The theatrical productions that were occasionally presented at court might contain themes or characters that were uncomfortably similar to your own situation, and your reaction to these performances could be particularly significant. The visual arts that decorated the court spaces and were given as gifts required your appreciation and understanding, but they also reflected the tastes and preferences of their creators and patrons. The literary works that were popular among the court elite required your familiarity and ability to discuss them intelligently, but they also contained ideas and themes that might be politically or morally challenging. The religious obligations and spiritual dimensions of court life created some of the most complex contradictions that you had to navigate. The daily prayers and religious observances that were expected of all court members required your participation, but they also highlighted the moral contradictions of your situation. The confession booth became a place where you had to acknowledge your sins while making it clear that you intended to continue committing them. The religious festivals and holy days required your devout participation while everyone was aware of the hypocrisy of your situation. The charitable works that were expected of court members provided opportunities for you to demonstrate your virtue and gain divine favor, but they also required resources and time that might be better spent on maintaining your position. The religious advisors and confessors who served the court were potential sources of spiritual guidance, but they were also political actors who might use their knowledge of your private thoughts and feelings for their own purposes. The theological debates and religious controversies that were part of medieval intellectual life required your understanding and appropriate response, but they also contained ideas that might be challenging to your faith or your position. And through all of this complexity, all of these contradictions, all of these impossible demands and dangerous situations, these women somehow found ways to maintain their humanity. They formed friendships with their servants, even knowing that those servants might betray them. They wrote letters to their families, even knowing that those letters might be intercepted and used against them. They found moments of joy in music, in poetry, in the beauty of the natural world. Even knowing that those moments might be their last, they fell in love, sometimes with the kings who controlled their fate, sometimes with other people who were equally trapped by the constraints of their world. They grieved for the children they lost, celebrated the ones who survived, and worried about the futures they were creating for the next generation. They prayed for forgiveness while continuing to sin, sought divine guidance while making earthly compromises, and maintained their faith while living lives that contradicted their beliefs. They were, in other words, fully human beings who happened to be trapped in impossible circumstances. Their stories remind us that humanity persists even in the most dehumanizing situations. that dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away, and that the human spirit is remarkably resilient in the face of overwhelming challenges. They show us that survival is not just about staying alive, but about maintaining your essential self, even when the world seems designed to destroy it. Their legacy is not just the historical records of their relationships with powerful men, but the example they provide of human endurance, creativity, and strength in the face of impossible odds. Why it sucked to be a royal mistress. Hey guys, tonight we're not stepping into the mind of a philosopher. We're stepping into the silk-draped chambers of power, but not the kind with romantic candlelit dinners, devoted love letters, or happily ever after fairy tales. No, tonight we dive into the real thing. Scandal, manipulation, jealousy, political schemes, and survival. This is what it actually meant to be a royal mistress. And spoiler alert, it looked nothing like the romanticized novels. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You awaken to the sound of something between a whispered message and a servant frantically tapping on your chamber door like your life depends on it. There is no snooze button, there is no peaceful morning. There is only the silk sheets and the deep spiritual ache of having slept alone while knowing your royal lover is 3 floors above you, probably with his wife. You try to stretch, but immediately remember the bruises from last night's passionate encounter. Your silk nightgown has twisted around your body like a clingy reminder of what you've become. Around you, a dozen other servants are stirring, each with the same look of pity and carefully practiced ignorance. One maid is already preparing your bath with lavender oil. Another is laying out the gown the king specifically requested you wear, the blue one that makes your eyes sparkle. You're not sure if you should feel flattered or like a well-dressed prisoner. Breakfast, by the way, is what we'd call historically significant luxury, with a side of existential dread. It's fresh bread so soft it could melt in your mouth, possibly baked this morning. You nibble carefully, not because you're savoring it, but because your stomach is twisted in knots from the constant anxiety of court life. The honey is golden, the fruits are perfect, and the wine is aged to perfection. You wash it down with the bitter knowledge that medieval royal favor was a game of political roulette. There's no time for genuine relaxation. Not that it matters. You haven't seen your own family in months, and frankly, that's probably for the best. You splash rose water on your face for the illusion of morning freshness. Then dress in garments that cost more than most people's annual income. Then come the summons. Present yourself. Look beautiful. Whispered by someone who clearly hasn't spent a day navigating the treacherous waters of royal court politics. The palace stirs. Nobles whisper. Jewelry clinks. And someone is already spreading rumors about your supposed influence over the king's latest decree. The marble floors echo with your silk slippers like they're announcing your arrival to every jealous courtier. You haven't even made eye contact with the king yet, and you're already exhausted, anxious, beautiful, and vaguely regretting your entire existence. And you know what the worst part is? This is one of the good mornings. The command is given. Attend. And so you do. Let's start with the obvious question. How exactly does one become a royal mistress? Well, it's not like there was a career fair booth labeled "Seeking Attractive Women for Morally Questionable Positions." The path to becoming a king's favorite was usually a combination of breathtaking beauty, terrible timing, and the kind of family connections that would make you simultaneously powerful and completely expendable. Most royal mistresses started as ladies-in-waiting, daughters of minor nobles, or wives of courtiers who caught the king's wandering eye during a feast, a hunt, or a particularly boring state ceremony. The selection process wasn't romantic. It was transactional. Kings didn't fall in love with serving girls from the village. They developed obsessions with women who were already embedded in the power structure, women who understood the rules of court, women who could be useful. Take Diane de Poitiers, mistress to Henry II of France. She wasn't some innocent maiden swept off her feet by royal charm. She was a widow, a political player, and 19 years older than the king. When Henry was still a teenage prince, she became his mentor, his lover, and eventually his most trusted advisor. But here's the thing about being chosen by a king. You don't get to say no, not really. When a monarch decides he wants you, refusal isn't just social suicide. It's often actual suicide. The king's desire wasn't a request. It was a royal command disguised as flattery. And if you tried to resist, well, there were dungeons for that. Sometimes families actively promoted their daughters for the role. The Boleyn family, for instance, had a strategy. Send the girls to court, make them irresistible, and hope one of them catches the king's attention. It worked. Anne Boleyn became Henry VIII's obsession, though that particular story didn't end well for anyone involved. Being selected meant you were beautiful enough to capture a king's attention, smart enough to navigate court politics, and desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at power. It meant you were willing to trade your reputation, your family's honor, and quite possibly your life for silk gowns and temporary influence. Most importantly, it meant you understood that you were never the main character in your own story. You were a supporting actress in the king's drama, and if the plot required your character to disappear, well, that was just good storytelling. Once you've been chosen, congratulations. You are now entering what can only be described as the world's most luxurious prison. Your new life as a royal mistress comes with a set of rules that would make a monastery seem relaxed. First, you must be available whenever the king desires your company. This doesn't mean Tuesday evenings and weekend brunches. This means 3 in the morning when he's had too much wine and wants to discuss his childhood. This means during state dinners when he gestures for you to approach the throne. This means when he's in the middle of planning a war and needs emotional support. Your schedule is no longer your own. You exist at the pleasure of a man who rules by divine right and has the attention span of a spoiled child. Second, you must be invisible when the queen is present. This requires a level of strategic disappearing that would impress a professional magician. You learn to read the subtle signs, the way servants avoid eye contact, the particular silence that falls over a room, the sound of the queen's footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. When she appears, you vanish. Not literally, though sometimes you wish you could. You slip through side doors, hide behind tapestries, or suddenly develop a pressing need to visit the chapel. The art of strategic absence becomes your most valuable skill. Third, you must never, ever show jealousy. Kings have wandering eyes. It's practically a job requirement. Today, you're his favorite. Tomorrow, it might be the new Italian ambassador's daughter or the visiting French duchess who speaks 5 languages and plays the lute. Your job is to smile graciously, compliment his excellent taste in women, and pretend your heart isn't slowly disintegrating. Jealousy is not just unattractive, it's dangerous. A jealous mistress is a liability, and liabilities in royal courts have a tendency to disappear. Fourth, you must be perpetually grateful. Every gift, every privilege, every moment of attention is a blessing you must acknowledge with the enthusiasm of someone who just discovered fire. The king has elevated you from obscurity to luxury. He has chosen you above all others. He has shown you favor beyond your wildest dreams. You must never forget this. You must never take it for granted. You must never act like you deserve any of it, because you don't. You're on borrowed time, living on borrowed power, wearing borrowed jewelry, and everyone, including you, knows it. Fifth, you must produce results. This doesn't mean children, though that's certainly expected. This means political advantages. You're not just a beautiful ornament, you're a strategic asset. Your job is to whisper the right advice in the king's ear, to support his decisions, to make him feel wise and powerful and completely irresistible. You're part therapist, part political advisor, part trophy wife. And if you fail at any of these roles, well, there are always other beautiful women at court. The rules seem simple enough. Be available, be invisible, be grateful, be useful. Don't be jealous. But living by these rules while maintaining your sanity in your life, that's where things get complicated.